So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of the 2025-2026 season. This is our 24th season, and it's been full of interesting lectures featuring Maureen Brady. You've been to many of them, Cormac O'Malley, Timothy Mayer, and Scott Malloy. Tonight's lecture is sponsored, by Francis Furtado, in memory of his wife, Barbara Carr Furtado. And Mr. Furtado has been a steady supporter of the museum for many, many years. I'm Deanna Canini, president of the museum. We're winding down celebrating the Irish Heritage Month of March. It was a busy month for us, with museum being open on the weekends, trolley tour of Irish Newport with Mike Slane, and the Bonnie Street Cemetery tour with Steve Marino. Our interpretive center also has been open on Thames Street, and it will be open for one last weekend, this coming weekend on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, noon to 5. Please visit us if you haven't had a chance. We also have one tour left of St. Mary's Cemetery this coming Saturday, given by our chief storyteller and historian, Steve Marino. And then we'll close out the month with dancing at 40 Steps on Sunday at 3 o'clock. As you all know, we will draw the winning ticket for the Blasket Island package, a frame photo donated by Giles Norman from Kinsale, and a book donated by Paul Shea. And the big event, drawing for the winning tickets for the Luck of the Irish raffle. Exciting times at the close of this lecture. And thank you all for participating. This is a major fundraiser for the museum. And now to our major event. Tonight, we are fortunate, very fortunate, to have Dr. Sean O'Callaghan with us for his second visit to tell us stories about the lives of the Irish who lived on Blasket Islands. The uniqueness of the culture and the landscape have been captured in many books, helping to preserve the language and customs of old. Dr. Callahan is an associate professor in the Department of Religious and Theological Studies at Salve Regina University. As our flyer informed you of his great history and credentials, he grew up in Ireland and attended Irish-speaking schools and has a strong interest in Irish cultural history. He says his Irish is not as strong that used to
Very
be.
rusty.
He's rusty in his Irish. And if you read in the flyer, he has explored the intersection of artificial intelligence, religion, and culture. So I would have a conversation with him. So please welcome Dr. Callahan as he presents Echoing Ancient Voices, the Literacy and Cultural Legacy of Ireland's Blasket Islands. And I don't know.
Thank you.
Can you get that in him? I want to
I
fall.
think it's going to stay.
You got it?
Let's see.
What did I do?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
it'll be fine. Great. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and welcome, and thank you to all the folks on Zoom as well who are here. It's really nice to be here with you and to talk about the Blasket Islands and the literature that has come out of the Blasket Islands. It's been nice for me to go back to this literature. I studied it in school, studied it in Irish. I've long forgotten kind of, sort of fluent Irish now because I haven't spoken it to anybody in a very long time. But it's been really nice to look at the books again. And I'll talk a little bit about the books later on. But I just want to give an overview of the Blaskets first. And before I do that, I just want to ask, has anyone been to the Blasket Islands, or has anyone been to the Blasket Centre? Okay, you've been. Great. So quite a few people have been. That's great. Okay, and maybe you didn't go all the way to the islands. Maybe you just went to the Blasket Centre in Dunquin, but that's a great place. And that reminds me, I have to thank the Blasket Centre tonight for allowing me to use some photographs from their website. All right, so let's make a start. All right. Okay, so there's yes, and also Giles Norman, a photographer in Kinsale, just outside Cork. He gave us permission to use this wonderful photograph of the stone wall, and he's also donated a prize for the raffle tonight. Okay, right, so the Blasket Islands collectively consist of 6 small islands off the coast of County Kerry in southwest Ireland. And more specifically, they lie off the west coast of the Dingle Peninsula, one of the most spectacularly beautiful places in all of Ireland. So you can see where the Blasket Centre is. You can see Dingle and a Skull up a little bit further, Dingle, and then the Blasket Centre, and then the islands are there. The area of the peninsula is known in Irish as Corcagina, named after the goddess Dina. And so there you see that the name of the peninsula in Irish, Corcagina, named after the goddess Dina, and the tribe that's named for her. So the ancient inhabitants of the region were worshippers of this goddess Dina. So there you get a slightly better view of the islands there. And during the 1800s and the 1900s, the Dingle Peninsula, you know, many of you have been to the Dingle Peninsula. You know, even today it's got small, scattered rural towns. In the 1800s, early 1900s, even smaller and more scattered, and a sparsely populated, often impoverished region, steeped in farming and fishing. But the Blasket Islands were a world apart. Okay, so you saw where they were there. They're 3 miles off the coast, but they really were a world apart, even from nearby Dingle. And it's hard to overemphasize how different life on the islands was from just a few miles across the Blasket Sound. Because in the Blasket Islands, a whole unique Irish-speaking community lived with their own dialect of Irish, their own daily lifestyle and customs. They didn't work in shops, they didn't work in mills, they didn't have the same jobs that the people on the peninsula had. They didn't work in factories. They made their living from the land and the sea. They had no doctor, no ferries, no church, no priest, no stores, no plumbing, no electricity. They didn't even have trees on the island. Okay, there was a small school on the island which the children attended. And for a long time, the inhabitants of the Great Blasket, the biggest island, which I'll talk about soon, lived in houses where the animals coexisted with them, sharing the same indoor spaces. They had their own king, a man chosen from among them to interact with the outside world and organize them as a community. To get to the nearest populated village on the mainland, they had to row 3 miles across the Blasket Sound in precarious little boats known as Navogue. So there's a Navogue. And they didn't always use the sails. They used the sails only sometimes. So they would row. You can still see those boats on the peninsula. When they returned to the island or when they ferried a visitor there, they often maintained the custom of saying goodbye to Ireland. So that's kind of how they saw themselves. Okay, so they're turning around, they're saying goodbye to Ireland, and they're heading off to kind of almost like their own homeland, showing how much they saw themselves as a very different kind of community. Yet this tiny group of islands produced literature which ranks with some of the best in the world, and over a very short period of time. Produced by people who had little to no education. They told their stories to others who wrote them down, or some wrote themselves in the only language they knew, Blasket Irish. This small group of islands, of which only one could be considered permanently inhabited, drew to them in the late 1800s and early 1900s several scholars. And this is very, very key to understanding the history of the Blaskets, the scholars who came there. And Europe was rapidly changing. There were many scholars of language who longed to discover an unspoiled, pure culture which preserved oral traditions in the ancient ways. These women and men who hailed from many different countries, but tonight we're going to talk about some from Norway, France, and the United Kingdom. They learned Blasket Irish. Some spoke it like native speakers, so that they could drink from the spoken word of one of the last outposts of oral traditions in Europe. when one of these scholars, the young Cambridgeman George Thompson, later to be known by the Irish version of his name, Shosha Macamash, visited the islands in 1923. The author, Robert Canigal, who's published a truly excellent book on the Blaskets, described Thompson's journey to the Dingle Peninsula in these words. He said he was in one of the wildest corners of Ireland, so forlorn, neglected, and poor that its people had been leaving for America for almost 100 years. George was bound for a tiny village perched on the eastern face of a great rock rising from the water, 3 miles off the coast, rowed by rough-hewn, wool-sweatered men, across this unpredictable stretch of cold Atlantic to that tiny backward slip of an island. He would step from the modern world into what novelist E.M. Forster would call, with only modest exaggeration, a Neolithic civilization. And that's from Canigal's book on an Irish island. Has anybody read that book? It's an excellent book. It's a truly excellent book. And even though I'd read the Blasket literature many times, that book really helps you to kind of knit everything together. So the Blasket group consists of 6 main islands. The main island is the Great Blasket, or in Irish, on Blasket Moor. There you can see the village that Canigal talks about, that Canigal describes, and you can just see it. I won't go over there in case it disappears again. But those little white things, the white buildings, that's the village. It's about 4 miles long, or a half a mile wide, give or take. Lies 3 miles off the most westerly point of the Dingle Peninsula. At its highest point, the island rises to just over 1,000 feet. In the early 1900s, about 150 people lived there, and they were not part of a community that existed a long time. This wasn't a community that existed continually over hundreds of years, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So the settled community on the island was not an old one. Then there were 5 other smaller islands. Beginish, the little island, where the inhabitants of the Great Blasket would bring their cattle to graze. So that word Inish there, when you see Inish is island, okay? So if you go in to the Irish shop in town, on Thames Street, you'll see a fragrance called Inish, and it's island. It simply means island. There are 2 words for island in Irish, Inish and Ilon. So Beginish, Biog, small, the little island where the inhabitants of the Great Blasket would bring their cattle to graze. Then there was Tirach, the westerly island, which had a lighthouse. And this, I find this quite poignant. That would be the last light of Ireland that emigrants would see as they traveled to America, okay, in the lighthouse. One of the sayings often associated with the Blaskets is next parish, America. Then you had Inishtuishkert, the North Island. Here, potatoes were grown and sheep were grazed. Inishnabro, the island of the Quernstone. This island was used for summer grazing, and around its shores, seals were very plentiful for hunting. These were really small islands. And then finally, Inishvikalon, in Irish, Inishvik Eloin, or the island of the son of Eloin. And that's kind of famous in the last few decades for having been bought by the Irish Taoiseach of Prime Minister Charlie Haughey, and he built a home on there. So that's Inishvikalon. Now, if you happen to be doing nothing on the 23rd of September 2019, there's going to be a total solar eclipse, which is going to, the first place that eclipse is going to be seen in Europe is actually Inishvikalon. And I came across this on a Reddit site a few weeks ago. If you know Reddit, it's like a forum online. And I wondered if this was true. So I sent an email to NASA, and I basically put in the subject line Inishvikalon, and the solar eclipse of 2090. And someone got back to me very, very quickly within a few hours and actually sent me this it's gone again, that map that I just had there, sent me that map. And so you can see the line at the top, the blue, I'm not sure if it's blue or purple. That is the northernmost path of the eclipse. The blue line at the bottom, the southernmost path. So and then the middle one. And so you can see that it just skirts by Inishfickalong. So 23rd of September 2090, and I've just celebrated my 128th birthday. So I hope they have a senior discount, and I don't know how we're going to get there. I just wonder, are we going to be able to beam there in 2090 like they did in Star Trek? Are we going to be able to go on hover cars? Who knows what things will be like then? Okay, so so all of the islands then have remains of ancient settlements, old forts, beehive huts. You know, if you've been to the Dingle Peninsula, one of the sites you might be familiar with is these old stone beehive huts the monks used to live in. And so lots of ancient monuments to be found. So the Great Blasket was the only island in the 1800s and 1900s with a permanent community. We know a great deal about life on the Blaskets because of the writings of those who visited. But we know far, far more as a result of the books those visitors kind of inspired. They knew this was a culture on the edge. It could disappear at any moment. Europe was in a flux. Everything was changing. And it did disappear in the 1950s. And the visitors to the island urged the islanders to write their stories, to record their lives. And as a result, 4 main books were published. Some lesser known ones, but 4 main books. And there was Oliver na Hinisha, translated as Island Crosstalk, and that was produced by Tommaso Crichton in 1928. He lived on the island. We'll talk about him in a moment. On Tilonach, or the Islandman, also by Tommaso Crichton, published in 1929. Fihibrian of Foss, or 20 Years of Growing, by Mauricio Sullivan, published in 1933, and then Peg by Peg Sayers in 1936. And why these books all came out over, I think, an 8-year period, and the impact they had was not so much because the authors themselves viewed their lives as anything remarkable or noteworthy, but because others implored them to record their memories, which in the case of Tommaso Crichton, for example, dated back to 1856. At the very beginning of his book, he says, I was born on St. Thomas's Day, 1856. And these books paint a story of a way of life, and particularly an Irish-speaking way of life, fast disappearing in the New Ireland of the time. The late 1800s, as you know, saw Irish nationalists promoting and fostering a renewal of the Irish language. There was a growing realization that Irish culture was distinctive, it was rooted in its Gaelic past and Gaelic institutions, and it was threatened by rampant Anglicization. The visibility of the Irish language in public life had been massively eroded, seen at its starkest in the Anglicization of place names. Cities, towns, and villages and townlands throughout Ireland had lost a unique character evident in the original Irish names given to these localities. And those names reflected important historical, mythical, religious, geographical, and political information. And all that was lost when they were Anglicized. And I'll give you an example. The town that my paternal ancestors come from was originally called Monaster Armui, the monastery of the men who live on the plain. And then that gets anglicized to Fermoy. Well, Fermoy means nothing. You know, it doesn't really mean anything, does it? But the original name tells you something about something that was going on in the place. There was a monastery there, built, I think, in the 1300s, a Cistercian monastery. It was a monastery which was built on a plain. So now you have geographical information, you have religious information. Okay, and this This happened a lot in Ireland, that the names were anglicized. So places beginning with Dun, for example, now come from Doon, which means a fort. There was a fort there. So we talk about Dunquin, or in Irish, Dunquin, and then Doon is a fort. Queen, I think, means pleasant. So like a pleasant fort, okay? And so if you don't know that, then you don't have a sense of the history of the place. The Gaelic League was founded in 1893 by Douglas Hyde. He later became the first president of Ireland. He did amazing work at reviving the use of Irish. And when people looked for a heartland of the Irish language, they looked to the West, and they looked in particular to the islands, because it was there that the purest Irish was preserved. So they always looked to the West. They looked to the Blaskets. They looked to the Aran Islands. And among Irish speakers, great importance is attached to something called blos. I don't know if you've ever heard this word before, but blos, it means taste. So like it's a word that would be used for the taste of food, okay? But it also has a particular meaning when it comes to language. And it refers to the purity of the sound of Irish speech. So if you like the most wonderful compliment you can get as an Irish speaker in Ireland is somebody says you have a good blos. Okay, it's not just to do with accent, it's the rhythm of the speech, the cadences, the naturalness of the speech. And the Gaelic Leaguers living on the East Coast, which was largely English speaking, they were fluent in Irish, but they had picked up English speaking habits. You know, their pronunciation wasn't as pure as the pronunciation under the West. And they were aware that their accents were inevitably influenced by English sounds, and they would crave to be able to speak with the easy flow of island speech, unadulterated by English speech habits. So certainly some inhabitants of the Blasket Islands could speak English, and some had a little English, but they were really steeped in the sounds of their native tongue. The village on the Great Blasket was made up of 28 or 29 houses. No one seems to be able to make up their mind. So accounts differ. There were stone houses. It was a tiny village, but they talked about the lower village and the upper village. Okay, that was it. You're seeing practically the entire village. And I'll get to a description of the houses later, drawing for what Tommaso Crichton wrote about them. And it was to this small village that 4 men and 1 woman that I want to talk about tonight. Lots of people came, but there were 4 men and 1 woman who basically who were highly influential on the Blaskets. And they traveled separately in the early 1900s, brought there by their intense love of language and literature. There was a Norwegian, 2 Englishmen, 1 Irishman, and a French woman. And they were entranced by what they found there. They fell in love with the Islanders fell in love with them. They'd instinctively understood the culture. They'd developed a symbiotic relationship with it. They didn't settle there. They only visited. They never stayed for very, very long. They didn't marry into the island. They didn't try to change the island, but they acted as bridges between the island and the outside world. They were outsiders, but more than anyone else who visited the island, they were insiders. They lived for brief periods, usually in the house of the king, on this wild and lonely place. And when I studied the Blasket literature at school, we came across the names of these visitors a lot, these kind of honorary islanders. And all of the photographs I saw of them were of them as older people. And then when I read Canigal's book, he makes a point of how young they were when they came to the island. You know, that they were extremely young. And so I imagined them as older in years. The photographs I saw of them showed them to be middle-aged. And they were, in fact, very youthful. All of them were scholars, highly educated, drawn to the island people, first by their love of language and the fact that Ireland was an ancient tongue. And secondly, they came because of the oral tradition embedded in the storytelling, which at that time was still very, very prevalent in life all over Ireland. but in a special way in the memories of the islanders. The kind of most important one of them in many ways was Karl Marstrander. And Marstrander was a Norwegian. He was an expert linguist at the University of Oslo. His first visit to the Blaskets was in 1907. He was a tall, athletic man. He reveled in the geography of the islands, the steep cliffs, the rocky landscape, the emptiness, the silence, the cry of the birds, and the crashing of the waves against the jagged rocks. And it's thought, nobody quite knows where the word Blasket comes from, but it's thought that it may be an Old Norse word referring to jagged rocks. Marstrander was nicknamed On Luchlanach. You can see just after his name, I have the On Luchlanach the Scandinavian. And that's what the islanders named him. He quickly endeared himself to them. He learned Irish, in which he quickly became proficient. He learned from Tomás O'Crihan. I think I've got a photo of O'Crihan in the next. Yeah, so there's Tomás O'Crihan. So born in 1850, there's kind of dispute whether it was 1855 or 1856. I think the Blasket Center says 1855. I think in his autobiography he says 1856. So there's O'Crihan. So Marstrander learned from him. As a result of Marstrander's studies, he was already expert in Old Irish, the language from about the 600s to the 900s. He was an expert in Middle Irish, the language from the 900s to the 1200s. And then, of course, there was early modern Irish, came later, but that's the kind of Irish he wanted to learn. So he knew Old Irish, he knew Middle Irish, and he really wanted to learn modern Irish. And so that was the reason he came to the Blaskets. And it might seem surprising that the University of Oslo and other European universities would be teaching Old and Middle Irish, but they were. And in Scandinavia, especially, a renewed interest in Viking history had led to a desire to understand the cultures that the Vikings had come into contact with. And in Europe in general, linguistic scholars wanted to study the origins of languages. So getting back to the roots through contact with communities where the languages in their older forms were spoken continuously was vital. No place was better for that than a place on the very edge of Europe. In terms of geography, you could not get more on the edge of Europe than the Blaskets. And Marstrander had not originally intended to go to the Blaskets. He went to the Kerry mainland, but there, like, Irish was spoken, but a lot of English was spoken too. And he found it very, very hard to get people to speak Irish to him. So he had to drag conversations out of people. So on advice, he headed to the Blaskets. And when he arrived at the Great Blaskets, he noticed something, he remarked on something many visitors of the time remarked upon, that whenever a boat was coming across the sound from Dunquin or Dunquin, all of the islanders would gather on the cliff to welcome whoever was coming. So that really endeared him to the island when he saw that. Tomás O'Crihan became Marstrander's teacher. He was unusual among the islanders. He could read and write Irish. Almost everyone else could speak it fluently, but were not literate in it. Tomás also knew a little English. There had been a small school on the island for many decades. Ooh, that hasn't turned out so well. But that's the school. If you were able to see it, to the right-hand side, to your right is the teacher and some school children standing outside there. A teacher lived on the island sometimes. Sometimes they got rowed in and left Fridays to Sundays, and other times they were cut off on the island. This happened a lot on the island. People would be cut off because obviously bad weather and that. In his book on Tilánach, however, O'Crihan, he talks a lot about food on the island and how plentiful it was. So even if you were cut off, you had plenty of food to eat. Now, it was fairly monotonous, but it was food. And the village that Marstrander visited in 1907 had, at that stage, as I mentioned, about 150 families. The families did not have ancient ties to the island. They'd settled there gradually over about a century and a half. One account of the island from 1774 says that there were 6 families living there, all of them healthy. The account even states, and it's hard to believe, that in the 45 years prior to the account being written, no one, either man, woman, or child, had died on the island. But the writer noted that of those who traveled back to the mainland, I'm assuming to live, many did die. Some local families had settled on the island from the mainland to escape the harsh conditions imposed by landlords, and others had married into island families and moved out there. There were about 65 buildings in total in the village, 28 or 29 of them dwelling houses, and the rest outbuildings. Hens made nests in the thatch of the houses, and eggs were easily available. Potatoes were grown on the Blasket and the smaller islands. Turf for fires was cut in various parts of the island and transported. So you can see a woman there. That's like the only road on the island. Was built in 1810. Like, it looks very precarious there to be with a donkey on the edge of the. But you can't see it so well, but there are panniers on each side of the donkey. So they would put the turf into the panniers and then transport the turf back to the village. Horses had once been on the island, but eventually donkeys only. During O'Crichan's early years, animals were kept at night inside the cottages, which usually consisted of just maybe 2 rooms. The sleeping quarters separated from the kitchen area by a dresser laid across the floor from the wall. God knows how animals and humans fitted together in these spaces, but they did. And as the hens laid in the thatch, often eggs would fall down on people. So later, the animals were kept outside in lean-tos constructed of stone. Larger houses were about 12 by 25 feet, but many more were smaller than that. I just want to read a short extract from O'Crichan's book about the houses. Just give me 1 second. He says, I may as well give some brief account here of the way we managed things in this island when I was young, more particularly since the fashion of that world has passed away and nobody now living remembers it except a few old people. As for the houses that we had in my youth and for some time after, they differed among themselves, just as in other places. Some of them had a handsomer appearance than the rest, and others were pretty wretched. A number of them were only 10 feet by 8. Others were larger, from that size to 15 or 20 feet long. To divide the house into 2, a dresser stood out from the wall in the middle of the floor, and a partition met it from the other side. There were 2 beds in the lower portion where people slept. Potatoes would be stored under the beds. A great chest was kept between the 2 beds, up against the gable end. On the other side of the partition, the kitchen side, the family used to spend the whole day or part of the day, 10 of them perhaps. There was a coop against the partition with hens in it, and a broody hen just by it in an old cooking pot. At night time, there would be a cow or 2, a calf or 2, a donkey, the dog on a chain by the wall or running about the house. In a house with a large family, you would find a post bed or maybe a bed on the floor. The old people used to spend the night in that beside the fire, with an old stump of a clay pipe going, or 2 pipes if there were 2 of them living, and smoking away. They would have a wisp of straw for a pipe lighter. A good fire of fine turf smoldered away till morning. Every time they woke, they took a light from the fire and puffed at the pipe. If the old woman was alive, the old man would stretch across to give her a light from the wisp. Then the smoke from the 2 old pipes would drift up the chimney, and you could imagine that the couple's bed was a steamship as they puffed away in full blast. 2 or 3 dogs would stretch out of the floor of the bed, the cow or the cows below them, head to the wall. There would be a calf or 2 with the run of the kitchen, lying muzzle to the fire. The donkey would be tied up on the other side of the house, opposite the cows, and a cat with a couple of kittens maybe in the chimney niche. The rest of the trumpery in the house was stuffed under the post bed for the night. So as you can see, like pretty full houses, you know. Many ships were wrecked off the coast of the Blaskets, so the contents of cargo regularly washed ashore. These contents sometimes provided the islanders with extra food. There's an account where a quantity of wheat, for example, washed up. Other times it could be hardware, which could be sold back at the mainland, such as one account of hundreds of metal balls. Tomás O'Croghan tells the story, I think, of his father going down to the beach. There are hundreds of metal bolts there. And he says the islanders live very well from those metal bolts for about a year. So many ships were wrecked off the Blaskets, the contents regularly washed ashore, and wheat and palm oil. He talks at one stage about palm oil, and sometimes the customs men would come in to take what had been wrecked, to take some of the goods, and the islanders would pelt them with stones. So dairy cows and cattle provided milk and meat. Oats were grown, cabbage, turnips, carrots. Sheep were kept for wool, for meat, and also to be sold at market in Dingle, Dunqueen, or Ballyferriter on the mainland. Islanders in their navogues would travel to the towns on the Dingle Peninsula, even as far as Tralee, which was a large town even then, to buy, sell, and bring money and goods back to the island. O'Croghan remarks that in his younger years, tea, surprisingly, was unknown on the island, and no one had a kettle. And then he remarks that in later years, tea was one of the items the islanders would bring back with them. But by far the most plentiful food supply was, of course, fish. Excuse me. In his book, Tomás makes numerous references to fishermen catching about 1,000 fish. And I think I can't remember whether it's Tomás O'Croghan or Maurice O'Sullivan, but they talk about one day when the fishermen caught 8,000 fish. Okay, so fish were like very, very plentiful. When he talks about his school days, he describes his mother boiling potatoes and fish in milk for breakfast. And this particular dish seems to have been a major part of his diet growing up. There were also huge numbers of rabbits over the different islands, and they were a rich source of sustenance as well. Proximity to the sea and a rich source of food saved many on the Blaskets during time of want, especially during the famine years, but also during the years of the Second World War, when food was scarce due to rationing. The navogue was light, cheap to make, easy to handle. It was preferred to any kind of sailing boat. The fishermen caught mackerel, scad, lobster, pilchards. They harvested limpets from the rocks, which they roasted in the fire. And the website, if you're interested in knowing more, the website of the Blasket Centre at Dunqueen has very informative sections about food from the land and food from the sea. There were no trees on the island, but driftwood, as well as the ever-present turf and peat, were used to give warmth to the houses, provide heat for cooking. It was still a hard life, and all the Blasket authors talk about the hardships of the island. Being cut off for long periods, the driving rain across the island, which anyone who spent any time in County Kerry will be familiar with, the isolation in times of childbirth, in times of illness. But all of those who visited the island, Marstrander and others, spoke lavishly of the nights of music and dancing in people's homes, the storytelling, the dancing on the cliffs, in the moonlight, walking and dancing on the beaches, the young people of the island spilling out across the island in the evening and the night, the singing that could be heard as people stood out in the open and sang for each other. Karl Marstrander drank in island life. He took part in every aspect of it. He was an Olympic level pole vaulter, and he would astound people by taking, remember we saw the photograph of the navogue, and you had the sail, and he would take one of those masts and he would use it as a pole vault, and he would pole vault over the houses. And really it was Marstrander who became the catalyst for everything else that happened between the outside world. And by that I mean the scholars who visited. He was the first to show people there was something there. There was something special, something beautiful, something fragile, echoes of an ancient world which could still be clearly heard, which needed to be listened to before the modern world drowned it out forever. Marstrander went on to become a world-renowned linguist. He got a post teaching in Celtic studies at the School of Irish Learning in Dublin, which had been started by a German, Kuno Meyer. At that school, a young language scholar, Robin Flower, became involved, went to Marstrander's classes. And Flower, you see, I just got after his date of birth and death there, Blaheen, that was his nickname. The Irish word for flower is blah, B-L-A, and then a father like it, which the accent, B-L-A-T-H, and Blaheen is little flower. So that was his nickname on the island. Anything with een, whenever you see een at the end of a word in Irish, it usually means small. Okay, so if your name is Kathleen or Noreen, it's like a diminutive. This young man sat, you can see him there, he's talking to Tomás O'Crihan. He sat under the teaching of Marstrander. He was the assistant keeper of manuscripts at the British Museum. And the British Museum had a collection of a number of manuscripts in Old and Middle Irish. And he was in Dublin to try to learn the skills to work on these documents. He loved it. He loved Marstrander. He wanted to learn modern Irish as well. Marstrander told him about the Blasket Islands. It is pure language, and Flower arrived on the Great Blasket in 1910 at the age of 28, staying in the house of the king. And his relationship with the islanders was very impactful. He returned to the island over and over again. He wrote the foreword to Tomás's book when it was published in 1929. And then he mentions in that foreword, he mentions that another man had engaged a lot with Tomás and brought Tomás's writings to the outside world. And that other man was Brian O'Callig. And Brian O'Callig, or Brian Kelly, was from Killarney. He was a brilliant scholar. He'd attended Trinity College. It was he more than anyone else who convinced Tomás to write. He and Tomás had corresponded regularly, resulting in the publication in 1928 of the collection of their correspondence published as Álagar na Hinishe, or Island Crosstalk. He persuaded Tomás to write by pressing on him the importance of what he had to say. The islanders themselves saw nothing remarkable about their lives. This is just how they lived. But this was a period where literature from what was called peasant communities was being published and gaining wide audiences as people realized that inhabitants of tiny, impoverished places could also have stories to tell. And so when Brian O'Callig went to the island, he brought with him books by Maxim Gorky, the Russian, and a book about the lives of Icelandic fishermen. And he just said, look, these books have been published. They're kind of world-class books, and people want to know about the lives of Russian peasants and Icelandic fishermen. They also want to know about your life. Robin Flower became a major chronicler of life in the Blasket Islands. He published a book called The Western Island, or The Great Blasket, in 1944. He threw himself into island life, helped with construction projects, learned modern Irish, and it was through Flower that the next great scholar came under the spell of the Blaskets. And that's this man, George Thompson, known usually by the Irish version of his name, Saoirse Macamash. And he had developed an intense interest in Irish history and politics. He joined the Gaelic League. He began learning the language. He lived in London. He took classes in the centre of London. A friend of his introduced him to Robin Flower at the British Museum. And in the summer of 1923, George, then only 20 years old, made his way across Ireland to Dunhuin and out to the Great Blasket. And in no time at all, he came into contact with Mirish O'Sullivan, and they were both the same age. Both of them became fast friends. The island grabbed Thompson's heart just as it had done Marstrander and Flower, and he returned again and again, making sure to keep in contact with the islanders by letter when he was not there. And Mirish had been seriously contemplating moving to America, but George persuaded him to stay in Ireland to become a guard in the new police force. So at least he would get to stay in the country. He encouraged Thomas to write his life story, and then this appeared as Fehe Bliana Fós, or 20 Years of Growing. Mauritius' father, that appeared in 1933. Mauritius' father had died when he was just 6 months old. He was placed in an orphanage on the mainland until the age of 6. And when he returned to the island, he had to learn Irish from scratch. He was a good storyteller. His father was a renowned storyteller. His father was called a Shanachie. So Shanachie is like basically a storyteller, almost sometimes a professional storyteller. And the title of the book, Fehe Bliana Fós, 20 Years of Growing, is taken from a saying his grandfather had: 20 years of growing, 20 years in bloom, 20 years of stooping, 20 years declining. And George Thompson and Moya Llewellyn Davis, who was an Irish Republican activist and Gaelic scholar, they translated Fehe Bliana Fós into English. So far we've encountered 4 male scholars strongly connected to the island. And if you look at the Blasket Centre's website page on scholars who visited the island, it too only mentions the men. But Robert Canigal's book tells the story of Marie-Louise Sostedt. And I don't have a photograph of her because it was very difficult to find a photograph of her. And the ones I found, I couldn't work out to ask for permission to use it. But she was a linguist of the Sorbonne in Paris. She'd studied Greek and Czech and Russian. And from 1924 to 25, she was awarded a lectureship in Trinity. She wrote Celtic Gods and Heroes, which was published in 1940. And she immersed herself in Blasket life. She was very influential on the Blaskets. She went there a lot. She researched the decline of Irish in West Kerry, the influence of returning emigrants from America, and the influence their speech had on the Irish language, students coming to learn Irish who spoke it in English amongst themselves, and therefore the Islanders picked up their English. And she noticed all of these Englishisms, for want of a better word, creeping into Irish speech. So she was very passionate about Irish life and declared O'Crichan's book about his life a classic. You can see then that so many people were passionate about this isolated group of islands. The last author I want to mention is kind of a controversial one, Peg Sayers. She's controversial not because of herself. She didn't do anything controversial, but her autobiography, Peg, was placed on the curriculum of Irish senior schools for several decades, and it didn't go down well with students. It elicited a very, very negative response from students because Peg had a lot of things going on in her life. And so the whole book is like disaster after disaster. And so young people reading this in a kind of a more modern Ireland, reading the book at a separation of about 40 years, they felt that Peg painted Ireland in a very bad light. And all of the island customs and life events that have so fascinated the scholars we've talked about in the 20s and 30s to the youngsters of the 70s and 80s, they just kind of represented an Ireland they really wanted to forget about. And you can just see, like, every single Irish student who has studied Peg will be able to recite off by heart the first line of the book. Shan van is shamisha inish, a will cuslay sinwig, is a cosella eramruach. I'm an old woman now with one foot in the grave and the other on its edge. And then the book kind of goes downhill from there. So the problem, and one of the problems I think is that the book was never contextualized. The Irish education system at the time wasn't interested in social history. Peg was just used to teach Irish. And so nobody understood the context of this book. And it's interesting, Canigal, who I've mentioned a few times, he he really appreciates Peg. And the Irish in Peg is beautiful Irish. She was a superb storyteller. She was born on the mainland. She married into the island. She spoke Irish and English. She couldn't write Irish, so she dictated her autobiography to her son. And Peg had proven to be a rich source of stories for many folklorists who visited the island. And the memory of Peg has undergone a revolution in recent years. In Canada's book, he makes a strong defense of her as being misunderstood, misrepresented, by the way she was portrayed as a personification of all things people wanted to forget about the Ireland of her time. He argues that Peg in her youth was very beautiful, very active. As she aged, she was strong, funny, flirtatious even. Now, when her book is studied in university settings, interestingly enough, it's in the context of the study of the role of women in Irish society at the time. And I think that opens up a space to view Peg in a very different way, to view Peg, like when you look at her through the lens of social history, you understand her in very, very different ways. And one publication that I came across by Circus Sinead de Brún of the University of Limerick is entitled Island Girl, Universal Woman, Peg, a scale féin. That means her own story as narrative of class labor and femininity. And de Brún says, arguing that the text belongs to the shared histories of women across the world, from China to the Middle East and Africa, I conclude that Peg is one of the most emotionally rich books in modern Irish. That's not how we learned it. We learned, like it was, people were very negative towards Peg. But as you grow older, you have an appreciation for it. Okay, moving towards an end. I got to finish in a second. Peg's book was published in 1936. By 1942, she had left the island. The decline of the Blaskets between 1928, when Tomás's book, Outpost, was published, and 1953, when the last inhabitants left the island, was rapid. That period was only 25 years. Can you imagine? Like, just within 25 years of the height of Blasket literature, everybody disappeared from the island. The urgency of the Gaelic Leaguers and the international scholars was prophetic. The world that captivated them, a kind of Tír na nÓg, the name given to the Irish version of a kind of paradise world of myths, legends, magic, and heroes, vanished like a cloud of vapor in the blink of an eye. Just 25 years after the publication of Outpost and only 17 years after Peg's book, that world was gone. And not just the cultural world of the islanders. Brian O'Callaghan, who had inspired Tomás to write, he dies in 1936. Tomás himself dies in 1937. Marie-Louise Shostet dies in 1940. Robin Flower in 1946. Mauricio Suluan in 1950. Peg Sayers in 1958. The actors on the stage of this wonderful theatre of life were all being silenced. And now the island itself was about to be plunged into silence, its nightly singing no longer to be heard. The turf was running out. French boats were cornering the fishing market, and the islanders could no longer compete with size of catch or with price. The young started to emigrate to England and to America. The Second World War led to shortages of certain necessary staples like flour. After the war, tourism dried up. Money was more and more scarce. The school closed in 1941. Many left in 1942, among them Peg. For those who remained, life got harder. A death on the island during storms, which cut it off for days, convinced many of increased vulnerability. On November 17th, 1953, the final 21 inhabitants left the island. There's one phrase in the Blasket literature which everybody who has read it or part of it knows well. It's become a cliche in many ways because it's repeated so often in various circumstances, but it's very true. This is the phrase, Ní bheidh or le héadi a rístam. The likes of us will never be seen again. I don't want to romanticize island life because it was hard, it was tough, But the Blaskets were also Ireland's Tír na nÓg, the land of the young, the place where magic and myth and heroes could still be found. That we know about them and the fine detail of their lives is thanks to myriad young women and men who traveled to this Atlantic outpost on the edge of Europe and rescued their memory, which no one could have known was so close to extinction. We owe a great debt to the islanders and to those who preserved their memory. Thank you very much. One for the time, Jess.
Do we have any questions? But I have an apology that I kept calling you Dr. Callahan.
Right.
No, Dr. O'Callahan, I'm sorry. Any questions? And you have?
Yes.
Oh, hi. Great lecture. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Yes, so I was to the Blasket Center and I noticed that there was a connection between the Blasket Islanders and Springfield, Massachusetts.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I can't quite remember what that was, but a lot of the islanders had gone to America.
Right.
I think there was a girl called Maura Carney. Now, I might have this wrong. Maura Carney, I think she and George Thompson kind of liked each other. And then she went to America, and I think several of them ended up in some of the same places. So maybe that was the reason. Oh, sorry, I should use the mic. So maybe that was the reason for it. But a lot of the Blasket Islanders gathered together when they came to America. They lived in the same place and kind of supported each other. But how different it must have been. And Murish Osulawa in his book, when he's considering going to America, it's just very, very short. I'll just read it because it's only a few lines. So he's thinking about going to America, and his sister has just gone. His brother, I think, has gone. And he says when he was kind of resting with going to America or becoming a Garda, he says, I looked west at the edge of the sky where America should be lying, and I slipped back on the paths of thought. It seemed to me now that the new island was before me, that's America, with its fine streets and great high houses, some of them so tall that they scratched the sky, gold and silver out on the ditches, and nothing to do but gather it. I see the boys and girls who were once my companions walking the street, laughing brightly and well contented. I see my brother Sean, my sisters Maura and Eileen walking along with them, and they talking together. The tears were rising in my eyes, but I did not shed them. So it's like this connection with America, which was so strong because it has so many family members in there, over the pull that they had towards the place. For Murish, this was a very hard decision to make. He became a guard. He didn't like it. He eventually left the police force, and then he tragically drowned. He moved away from the island. He moved up to Connemara and drowned there in I think 1950. So yeah, there were very strong connections. Quite often people came back to the island from America, stayed a little while, and then went away again. So I think that's probably the connection.
Were such writers as Yeats and his contemporaries, were they at all interested in the Blasket Islands, maybe retelling their tales?
I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm not sure about Yeats. Singh was,
Yeah,
you know, writer. He was very interested, and I think he went over to the Blaskets before these scholars went, and the Blaskets had a very strong influence on the plays he later wrote. But Yeats, I don't know.
Oh, I was told many years ago in Springfield that many people from the Blaskets went to Hungry Hill, the Hungry Hill neighborhood in Springfield.
Okay, right, okay. Yeah, well, they kind of wanted to support each other.
Yeah.
And, you know, they would have like the customs of the island were very, very different from anywhere else. They had their own customs, their own way of doing things. Like one of the stories Tommaso Crichton tells in his book, I think it's Tomas, he talks about someone who dies on the island, so that person is ferried over to the mainland on the Navogue to be buried, because they didn't have like a consecrated cemetery on the island. And he says it was the custom that a woman would always go with the body. It was just something they did on the island. So they had their own little ways of doing things. And so for them, moving to America, wonderful in so many ways, but they must have often, when they went to bed at night and closed their eyes, they must have seen the Blaskets.
And then, and continuing with the same story, so the three of us were in Ireland on 1997, went to Great Blasket. And on the Dingle side, we had a waiter named Dermot Sears, who said, my whole family's in Springfield, Massachusetts
Okay.
right now. And he said, and so are all their friends. So Springfield was a popular
Yeah.
destination.
Amazing, yeah.
And then I have a question. So just as a captain of a ship would be the last to disembark in a sinking ship,
Yeah.
was the king the last person to leave the island?
I think so. Yes, I think he was. And I think the king had, like, there wouldn't have been one, like, there were lots of kings, because they died. And so they had a lot of kings. So I think the king, when the island was eventually evacuated, was not the king that Tomas and others talk about. But I think the king stayed around, yeah.
Is there a question from the side?
Was the king picked and voted on, or was it family? That's one question.
It was
And-
mostly just, it was kind of by consensus. It was someone who was strong, because the king would row the Navogue across to the mainland to pick up the mail, for example. So the mail would come into Dunquin, and he would go and collect it. So he had to be a good rower, had to be strong, had to be a good leader. So I kind of think it was more by consensus that they chose the king. So it wasn't from a particular family. And then he was called the Ree. So the Irish for king is Ree, or I father. The father is like the accent.
Thank you. How about religion? What did they practice Catholicism, and were they?
Yeah,
visited by
they
priests?
did, but they didn't have a church on the island. Once a year, a priest came to say mass, and then once a year, a priest came to say mass on the island. But then they would row across to the mainland every Sunday to go to mass. Yeah. So they would go the 3 miles, and then they would also do that to bury their dead. There was a small cemetery on the island, but I think it was mostly like for infants or for people who were killed in shipwrecks. So a lot of bodies washed up on the island, and they would bury them in this little cemetery, but it wasn't the island people themselves who got buried there. So they would go to the cemeteries on the mainland, and that's where they would go to mass. But then, of course, there would be some weeks or several weeks where they were cut off. So it would have been just themselves on the island.
Do we have time for one more?
Ready? Are we ready for the raffle at this point?
Maybe not.
No more questions?
Okay. Well, you
Bring up
can
the-
speak with him after. Okay. Yeah. We're doing the we're doing this one for.
Stay up. You have to show me what to do.
Right.
Okay, all right. I think,
Right.
yeah, hold on,
Just put this right.
let me move this lot out of the way.
Okay, so we'll pull the,
This is the one, this is
yeah,
the.
we're gonna pull for the Blasket Island. You pull from that bucket right there.
That one.
Kathy has it.
Okay.
Kathy and Ann have been working very, very hard on this.
Okay.
Um, so give her a lot of credit. Oh,
It's for the plane.
oh,
This, okay, you pull it and then you're gonna say the
yeah.
number.
No,
This is- no. Go ahead.
You're gonna pull it. This
Yeah.
is For the. frame.
For the frame and the, okay, the number is 859-567. I hope it's not mine. Shoot, I wonder if it is.
Someone's got it.
Okay, it's probably mine.
Oh, no, hold on.
Oh, we got it? 567?
859-567.
Is that Rick O'Neill?
O'Neill.
Yay!
Congratulations.
All right, Rick O'Neill is
We'll show you.
a member of the board and he is on the election week. Okay, now the big one. This is for $1,000. And as I said, this is our major fundraiser, so I appreciate all the support. We really do. Okay. Nerve-wracking. Oh, oh. Annabella Rajas, Rejas, Rajas, Rejas? Yeah, she's not here. Okay, all right. Where does she live? In Braintree, Mass. So isn't that nice? So our reach is out there. All right, next for the 2000 award. Okay. May Bussey. Is it Bussey? It's Bussey. Yeah, it's Bussey.
Bay Barry?
Oh, is it Barry?
Barry.
May Barry, I'm sorry.
Mary Barry. Mary,
Could be anyone.
but she said, I have her phone number.
We have everything on a register, so. She's in Jamestown. Okay, now the big one, the 3,000. Oh.
Right.
Okay, the roll call. Can I read this? Mary Coleman.
Very cool. Yeah.
Whoa! You here? What? Oh, sure. I know. Oh, well, thank you. From Narragansett. You got it. All right. Wow.
I have 4 children. I always put the
You, oh, you
name stuff.
oh, that's
Yeah.
nice. Okay. Oh, what,
Yeah.
congratulations.
Now you get checked. That's
Okay.
what
I'm gonna mail you one back too.
Okay, so this is our big winner, the father who gives it all to his children. Okay. Okay, good night all. and Thank you very much for attending all our lectures this season. I'll see you next year and I'll see you whenever. Bye-bye. Our annual meeting is April 26th. So you'll be getting information on that soon. Thank you.